You have been a sculptor for many, many years. When did you start?
Actually, I started at the age of 11, and we lived in a very small town, little farm community, and the teacher showed us a film from a of an Inuit carver, and it was probably made by the National Film Board sometime in the late 1940s or early 1950s. And it showed an Inuit carver picking up a piece of stone. Then he started working on it with various tools, and by the end of it, he held up an object that was full of magic, power, and I was hooked. And I went home and told my parents I wanted to be a carver, and they gave me a little set of small carving tools, and that's when it started.
This was in Wellesley.
Yes.
You grew up with a lot of nature.
I've always, yes, our family moved a great deal. My father was a pastor in the church, so we never spent more than a few years in any one place. One of the favorite places that we moved to was Deep River, which is up in the upper Ottawa Valley. And I loved the bush. I always loved the bush. And when I was a student at OCA, I used to hitchhike up to the Yukon and spend my summers working on construction, firefighting, all that sort of stuff to pay my tuition. So I've always been in touch with nature, yes.
What was your medium?
I always worked in wood. I've studied stone carving. I've always been a carver, reductive rather than building up. And but stone didn't speak to me the way wood did. I've always loved wood, and I just took to it immediately. And I always felt that it was where I wanted to be, was working with wood.
In the bush, you had lots of choices. What was your preferred wood?
Whatever I could, the best stuff I could get my hands on. Initially, I worked with basswood, which is basically the universal carving wood. In Europe, it's linden. In England, it's lime. Here, it's basswood. It's all more or less the same kind of wood. Lately, I've been working more with hardwoods for the last few years. Maple, walnut, cherry, largely because I can do more with it. The wood actually has more personality. Basswood is almost like paper. It really has no character of its own. You have to give it everything.
You've also traveled a lot and did a lot of manual labor in various countries.
I traveled a lot by bicycle. My first major trip was to go to, after I'd been to the Yukon, and then I went to Europe and bought a bicycle there and traveled around Europe on a bicycle. And when I ran out of money, this was in the early 1970s, it was easy to get work. And I would just find a job, any job. There were some really horrible jobs, but I would make enough money to go on to the next place. And I started picking up language. French was relatively easy because we had studied French in school here. And when I got to Switzerland, I was in the Swiss canton, and I got a job working in a ski resort hotel. And everybody in the village decided it was their job to teach me French. So it really helped. My French got almost good. And when I was invited to exhibit at the Biennale in Florence, my wife and I studied Italian for a year and a half. And the French background helped with that a lot. And then a few years, just not so long ago, we decided to start visiting Spain more often. And so I've been studying Spanish. The influence was never really from other artists. Most of the influence of my life was from what I was seeing in my own travels and what I was experiencing in my own life. Because most of the things I did to keep myself alive had nothing to do with art. I became a journeyman carpenter while living in New Zealand. And while I was working in Australia, I experienced enormous terror based largely on too much exposure to saltwater crocodiles. And it was that experience that pushed me to say, okay, that's enough. Let's get serious about making art. And so I had been living in New Zealand at the time. I returned to New Zealand and really started pushing myself to start making art. And I kind of started all over again the way I had been in high school. I said, okay, let's just forget everything you've learned in art school and start from the beginning. And that's what I did in New Zealand. And I ended up with an exhibition in their National Art Gallery there.
Your art captures motion and it also captures stillness.
Yeah, the motion is partly because I love motion in my own life. I don't sit still. I'm in my late 70s now and I still ride my bike regularly. And I ride hard, I ride fast. And just this past September, my wife and I spent a month cycling in France. To me, motion is life. And often, like the series of dancers that I started working on was also triggered by a family crisis. When my father developed pancreatic cancer, and I went down to see him, and we had a long visit about that. And those are the kinds of moments in your life when it's like the big lights are turned on. And you just, everything is brighter and sharper because your whole sense of focus is completely changed. You're facing something that's like, this is, your whole brain just has to change gears, and you're focused on something much bigger than yourself. And I saw a tiny little picture of a dancer in a magazine, and I looked at it, and it just, like, it grew so huge in my mind, that this little picture, and it was partly the circumstance of the occasion that sort of brought this thing into such a big focus. And as usual, there's always tension between fathers and sons. And I decided, okay, I'm just going to be straight. The moment requires that. And I just showed this tiny picture to my father, and I said, this is going to be my next sculpture. And that's when I started the dance series.
How many have you done?
About 12. I think 12.
And they are life-size.
They're all life-size, yeah.
In fact, a lot of your sculpture is life-size.
Yeah, that was also a result of finding a career in film and television, because that is such a demanding business, and they don't care about scale. If they want something big for the screen, they just say, make something big. And so, yeah. And as a very skilled craftsperson, they would call on me and they'd say, we need this, and we need it 40 feet high. And that was like a whole new challenge. And I really enjoyed it. In fact, I stayed in the business for 40 years because it was very challenging. And it paid a lot of bills. You're not poor when you're working in that business. So I could afford tools, I could afford materials, I could afford a decent studio. And the film business really, really helped with all that.
So you are an artist and an artisan.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. When I had finished my travels and I returned back to Canada from New Zealand, I really needed something productive to do. And I started looking for a carving place where I could work, because that's what I wanted to do. But I realized I did find a gentleman named Peter Cserháti, who was a master wood carver from Hungary. And he decided that he would try me, see how I could do. My skill level was at about, he gauged me to be at about the 7-year level of an apprentice, and the apprenticeship in his world was 15 years to become a master. He said, you are about halfway there to becoming a master carver. And then I went to work for him, and because I was already in my late 20s, I was in a hurry. So I worked 12 hours a day, 7 days a week to finish the final 8 years. And then one morning he came into the carving shop, and he started addressing me as Maestro Gordo. And that's not done lightly. He acknowledged me as a master at that point. And so from his point of view, I was now a master carver.
This means that you can make functional art.
Yeah. To be a master carver, you basically also first have to be a master cabinet maker. And I already had my journeyman qualifications as a carpenter. So I was partway there already. But part of it too is just a knowledge of all the world styles of carving. We were required, if a client came in and said, we would like this done in Renaissance style, you could do it. Just, the style. Or if they want French provincial, sure, I know how to do that. Or Egyptian or Oriental, you have to be able to turn your hand to any carving style that's ever been carved in the world and just do it without having to relearn it. You already know it.
Have you been approached to restore unique pieces?
Yes, I have. And it's always interesting. Usually it's insurance companies. It's often stuff that's been shipped here and been broken or damaged in shipping. And it can be anything. There was a 14th century, very, very large piece from France. And it was really a mess. And so I spent a few weeks fixing that up. And they were very happy with it. It worked very nicely. And it was French walnut. And they wanted me to find a matching wood. And they were hoping French walnut, but it's not available here. And it turned out English brown oak was perfect. And there have been pieces from people bought in Africa that have been damaged, so I fixed those. And another was, it was quite a funny set. Some people bought a dining room suite in Austria, and the chairs were too low and the table was too high. So when they sat down, they were all sitting like this. So they, instead of lowering the table, they wanted the chairs raised, and they were all carved legs. So I had to add probably about that much to each chair leg and then recarve it to match the original carvings. So that was kind of fun, except that they all had to hop onto the chairs now because the chairs were too high. But anyway, those are some of these projects can be a little bit absurd.
You are also a teacher.
Yes, yeah. And I was, in fact, Wednesday morning, I'm often very tired because I've been teaching. Monday, I teach from early in the morning till late at night. And Tuesday is a slightly shorter day, but I have, about 75 students and very demanding people. They all want a lot of attention. So
I'm sorry, 75 students in one room?
no, I take them 15 at a time. And that's the maximum. I can only teach 15 people at a time.
And you teach different levels?
I teach basically any level that comes in the door. I prefer beginners because I don't have to get rid of any bad habits that they've already picked up. Yeah, I'll teach people from absolute nothing, who've never picked up a tool in their life before, to people who've been carving. I just got a new student this term who has been carving for 20 years. He has no training. So basically I'm starting him almost like I would start a beginner. And what I do is I give them 5 exercises that get them handling the tools properly. And at that point, they choose. They can do whatever they want. And some people are very advanced and get right into some really interesting stuff. Other people need a longer on-ramp. And it doesn't matter what level they are because everybody gets individual attention during the class time.
What are the prerequisites for someone to study with you?
Nothing. I teach through the Toronto District School Board. So they register with the school board. The only people I have had to turn away, and it was very sad for me to do this, was from time to time, some poor mother who has an autistic child will bring this person in, and they are totally incapable of understanding how to hold a tool without hurting themselves. They just can't do it. But other than that, nobody gets turned away. Some people struggle more and decide it's not for them, but most people stick around. A lot of my students have been with me continuously for 15 years. During the daytime as seniors, 65 and over, and the night classes are for 18 and over.
You have one piece in a group show right now.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah, with the Canadian Sculpture Society. And it's actually one of my favorite pieces. It's called Three in a Boat. And it is one of the few pieces where I've referenced historical art, because I have the Mona Lisa's standing there, Primavera is standing there, and then I've inserted a really unpleasant looking oligarch into the boat. So these three people it's not even a boat, it's just a skeleton of a boat. And they're all sort of drifting off into nowhere because the boat isn't going to float. It's just a skeleton. And the women are looking, Mona Lisa is looking like who she is, a very privileged little princess. Primavera, she's looking back over her shoulder. She's a bit concerned, like, where the hell are we going? And the oligarch is looking down at nothing left. We've taken it all. We've ruined it. And he's got a look of absolute horror on his face.
How big it is?
It stands about 5.5 feet high.
How long is this show?
The show is over in March, so I'll be taking it out. But the latest series that I've just finished, I've done 32 portraits, which was a bit of a departure for me. I've always been good at carving faces, but I decided that I would do like a big project of 32 portraits based on historical figures. And I've very carefully selected pairs. So there are two faces. The faces are very close to a mirror. They're looking at themselves in a mirror. And on the backs of their heads, I've mounted mirrors as well, which are cut to the shape of the head. So when you approach this piece, there's a third figure, the viewer. And you can't look at it without seeing yourself in there. The first one I did was basically a woman was in the newspaper here in Toronto screaming in a doctor's office, demanding a white doctor. And I thought, this is just an ordinary person, but there's so much venom in that face. That just has to be recorded. It has to be done. So I carved her face, and I paired her with a Black American protester, a man protesting the blacks being arrested and often shot for something as minor as a burned out taillight on their car. And that started that whole series. And so now it's finished. So there's 16 pieces, 32 faces. I put Nelson Mandela with Aung San Suu Kyi, both Nobel laureates. He went in one direction. He became a great humanitarian. She's implicated in crimes against humanity. So that's another pair. I paired Walt Disney with Albert Einstein, um, both geniuses, a Jewish genius and an anti-Semitic genius, and so on. So I've got Francisco Franco there. I even did Donald Trump, which I carved out of scrap lumber. So, yeah, and I paired him with a face I found in the women's rally the day after his first inauguration, where they all wore those knitted hats. So I put those together as a pair. And I paired Leni Riefenstahl, Adolf Hitler's propagandist, with George Orwell. George Orwell hated propaganda. He was anti-propagandist. So the whole theme runs through, like the entire series are these pairs that are very carefully matched.
However, you do give voice to people from different points of view.
Yes.
You are not just focusing on, let's say, Nelson Mandela. You are also bringing the opposite, and you give both a voice.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah.
So you're trying to balance, in a way, the two, because you feel that it's important.
Oh, absolutely. This is kind of a culmination of many, many years of not just making art, but of living in the world, traveling a lot, working with many, many different people. And like when I was working in Australia, I spent a lot of time with the Aboriginals, not deliberately. They just happened to be there. And I worked in exploration work there, and I was driving a great deal through the bush. They would always jump into my vehicle, sit beside me. And so they were always there, which was kind of interesting because they're very gentle people. I never ever felt a minute of threat from them. They just like to go places. And if there's a vehicle going by and there's an empty seat, they'll hop in. So I like that about them. I like them. But it was a totally new experience for me to be enveloped by a culture that is so entirely different from our own. And, all of that, all this lifetime of experience, firefighting in the far north, doing exploration work in Australia, and then, making artwork for many years. And so it all culminated with this series that I call Mirror, Mirror.
You combine physical work with the intellectual work. How did you manage to balance them?
It's hard. I stay physically fit. That helps. I have no idea how the balance is achieved, really. I would have to go back over my entire life of sort of growing up in an extremely fundamentalist Christian home, and then fighting that and finding that question has sort of triggered a bit of an answer, because I've never really thought about that. But I had to struggle my way out of a very, very strict fundamentalist home. Art was never part of that. I mean, they weren't anti-art, but I was slated to become a missionary, and that's the last thing in the world I wanted. Except, in a way, I have become, but I'm a missionary for art instead of a missionary for the church. So, in a way, the circle has come all the way around. But the struggle to get out of that, I had to find myself all by myself. I didn't have a lot of help. And all those years of travel made that possible, because I was way around on the other side of the world. I was facing horrendous dangers, also just phenomenal pleasures. And, I loved it. I was on the other side of the planet. I was alone. And I had to make new friends. I had to make a new life. I had to make my life from zero several times.
You mentioned how harsh life in Australia was from the crocodile dangers. Have you ever carved a crocodile?
I had to carve one for a movie. They needed a crocodile to put in the water. So I kind of knew what I was doing when I carved that thing. It was not something I really cared that much about. I could do it, and I did a nice job of it. It's not a passion. People are more what I'm really interested in carving. The animal world, my wife and I just went to Spain a couple of years ago, and we managed to visit the 6 caves that you're still allowed to go into in northern Spain to see the prehistoric art. And that was the animal stuff that really moved me right to the core of my being, to see paintings and engravings that range between 20 and 40,000 years old, and how sophisticated they were, and how well they saw, and how difficult it was, because when you see these caves, these paintings, they're a long way down. They're not at the front of the cave. You have to crawl through these spaces to get down to where the paintings are. And the whole experience was just astounding. We loved it. And it was also extremely moving.
Did you have the chance to visit the caves in Ontario?
I have seen some petroglyphs in Ontario. And I've also, during my exploration work in Australia, I came across huge galleries of Aboriginal paintings on the escarpments. And I may have been one of the very few white people that have ever seen them, because I was out there trying to find my way through the bush to set up an exploration camp. And I would come across these things. They're still working on them. They don't stop. The paintings on the Australian escarpments can range from yesterday to 50,000 years old, all in the same place.
It's like a continuum?
Yeah. Yeah, they don't leave it alone. They continue painting.
You have just finished a series of sculptures. You have a piece in a show.
Mm-hmm.
Where do you go from here?
Right now, I had a little bit of a setback with the Mirror show, because I had an exhibition booked for that show. The curator retired and a new curator came in, and she's not so happy with this particular project, so they canceled it. So I have to look for a new venue for it. So that's my challenge at the moment, is finding a new gallery for this particular series. As usual, I have much better reception in Europe than I have in Canada. Any sales that I've made have all been in Europe. Canadians, I mean, right now we're in a real crisis. So people, their focus is going to be changed. They're not going to be buying art. It's not a priority in this country. But I think in places like France and Germany, it doesn't matter if there's a crisis. The art is still there, and it's still important.
Are you looking for gallery space in Ontario or anywhere in Canada?
I've had a few very successful shows in Ontario, Cobourg, Waterloo, Richmond Hill, very, very receptive audiences, and very pleasant shows. So I'm going to be looking into those galleries again to see if they'd be interested. But I'm also going to be approaching European galleries. I got a call a couple of weeks ago from a gallery in Barcelona, and they expressed some interest, so I'm going to keep following that up.
How can people find you?
I have an Instagram page. I have a LinkedIn page. The gallery from Barcelona that found me through Instagram. And I guess I'm fairly new to this sort of digital world. And thank goodness I have a young student who works in that industry. And he helped me set up a bunch of this stuff. And so he encouraged me. He sort of got the pages set up and showed me how to keep them up. Because putting it in a physical gallery is nice, but you're only going to like in Toronto, you might get 100 people to see the work, whereas on Instagram, you get millions.
Do you experience any challenges getting your medium in Toronto?
No, no, it's, I have basically a fully equipped workshop. The wood is easy to get. It is a rather common substance, so there's nothing exotic about it. I do have some rare exotic woods that are almost impossible to get, which I've hung on to for a long time, thinking someday I'll use this. I have a fairly big stock of stuff like that. I'm not concerned at all about running out of material or like equipment. I've got all the equipment I'll ever need. So yeah, that's all set up. All I need is an idea and I can just go do it. Yeah, actually, one thing that always pops up is the question of where do you think you fit in the long trajectory of the art history? And like in the academic world, you kind of try to find, you want to put the last letter on the last sentence of the big thesis of fine art. That's something I don't care about. I just want to do my work. And because figurative art has been out of fashion for quite a long time now, thank you, Glenn Greenberg. It's just, that's what I do, that's what I like to do. And at some point, I just thought, I don't care if it's out of fashion. I'm going to do it anyway. Because the fashions come and go. This is what I'm good at. This is what I'm passionate about. And this is what I'm going to make. So I'm not concerned about where I fit in that long thesis. I'm just going to do my own thing. And people can like it or not like it. I don't care.